Day 83, I'm reading If God is Love, 115 page. Okay, here we go. For many, religion is a means of controlling human behavior. Dualistic religion, with the threat of hell and the offer of heaven, is especially susceptible to this temptation. Pain and pleasure, the two primary human stimulants, become the tool of salvation. Unfortunately, the reliance of this religion on such primal instincts ignores those faculties that elevate humans from the animal kingdom. Our ability to endure pain and forego pleasure in the pursuit of what is good and noble. Ironically, when we reduce religion to a controlling mechanism, we often create humans with little self-control. A mother, after hearing me speak on God's universal grace, complained, "Don't be telling my son that everyone will be saved. It's taken me years to put that fear of God in him, and I don't want him going crazy now." Sadly, we soon learned her son had been involved in some sexually deviant behavior. Fear had not produced the control she had hoped for. Her son, having been manipulated by the threat of pain and offer of pleasure, was unable to discover any higher motive for his life. I saw this dynamic often in the conservative Christian college I attended, where we had to sign a lifestyle statement pledging to not drink, smoke, dance, or be sexually active during our 4 years of college. What? Those who'd been most tightly controlled during their upbringing were the first to self-destruct when given the least bit of freedom. When these students were expelled, their parents often blamed college for being too permissive. The problem with controlling religion is that it is so convinced of the depravity of humanity that it cannot believe anyone could live a good life without manipulation or coercion. The moral atheist is a mystery to many religious people. It was no mystery to Jesus. He thought goodness the product of an internal commitment and not an external demand. He said, "The good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of evil treasure produces evil." To extend Jesus' metaphor, goodness is rooted in a commitment to love others. Those who love are good. Those who are good love. In my experience, this quality is not limited to Christians or even the religious. Wherever compassion occurs, God is present, willing to be anonymous as long as his children are being loved. Goodness is never about controlling others, but about loving them. Jesus turns controlling religion, with its inflexible laws and requirements, on its head. The point isn't obeying the rules, an act of the will, but in producing good fruits, an overflow of the heart. Our hearts are changed only when we realize God's unconditional love for us and embrace our responsibility to love others unconditionally. We don't need to accept Jesus into our hearts. We need to have the same heart as Jesus. When 5-year-old Stacy said, "Well, I can ask him out too," she wasn't rejecting the life and message of Jesus. She was rejecting a type of religion meant to control rather than encourage. I think she made the right choice. She recognized the lack of grace. She was willing to say at 5 what I couldn't say until I was 35. If that's what religion is, I want nothing to do with it. This is why many have left the church, synagogue, and mosque. They aren't atheists. They've simply found the courage to reject religious fear and control. They seek a spiritually consistent with what they sense to be true. There must be more to life than escaping hell and keeping the rules. They yearn for a way of life that is gentle, humble, open, and compassionate. Gentle religion. In Traveling Mercies, Some Thoughts on Faith, and that's a book, name of the book. Anne Lamott tells of her conversion to Christianity. After many years of spiritual wandering and self-destructive behavior, she found herself attending a small Presbyterian church. I went back to St. Andrew about once a month. No one tried to con me into sitting down or staying. I always left before the sermon. I love singing, even about Jesus, but I didn't want to be preached at about him. At the same time, Lamott's life was a mess. Her dearest friend was dying of cancer. She was despondent following an abortion. She spent many days in a drugged and alcoholic stupor. In the midst of her deep depression, she describes a presence, something like having a cat watching her. I felt him sitting there on his haunches in the corner of my sleeping loft, watching me with patience and love, and I squinched my eyes shut. But that didn't help because that's not what I was seeing him with. 1 week later, Lamotte was sitting at St. Andrew when the singing touched the chord deep within her. I began to cry and left before the benediction, and I raced home and felt a little cat running along at my heels, and I walked down the dock past dozens of potted flowers, under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams. And I opened the door of my houseboat, and I stood there a minute, and I hung my head and said, "Fuck it, I quit." I took a long deep breath and said out loud, "All right, you can come in." In the churches I grew up in, people would have been so offended by Lamotte's language they have missed the beauty of her description of God. The God she experienced was gently persistent, waiting patiently for her response, and loving her too much to violate her autonomy. Loving her too much to violate her autonomy. Fortunately, the church Lamotte was attending was equally gracious, giving her space to wrestle with God. I'm glad Anne Lamotte didn't attend my church first. I'd been taught to pursue reluctant, resistant, and lost. I contacted people within 24 hours of their first visit. I'd barged into their homes, interrogate them about their spiritual status, and imply they needed to get right with God. If they missed a Sunday, I'd hunt them down and ask what was wrong. If Lamotte had shared her struggles, I would have been quick to offer platitudes and assurances. I was an aggressive Christian, more like a pit bull than a kitten. If you'd asked me what motivated my behavior, I would have claimed a deep concern for saving the lost. In retrospect, I realized my motives weren't always so pure. It was my first pastoral, and like any person in a new career, I wanted to be successful. I counted every person who attended worship and each Sunday. When the numbers were up, I was happy. When attendance was down, I was depressed. My ministry, even when it spoke God's grace, wasn't always gracious. I wanted people to join my church, adopt my beliefs, conform to my expectation, and do this as quickly as possible. My ministry was often selfish, aggressive, and ungracious. Okay, I should stop here. Please correct me if you can. Bye.